Hey guys, welcome to Winter Quarters with the Uniformed Historian. I've decided during the cold winter months that are approaching, we're going to be moving our videos indoors so that we can continue to tell the stories of our ancestors who came before us and fought in the American Civil War. And I thought today I would kick off the Winter Quarters series by talking about my fourth great-grandfather, Eli Cooper of the 36th Virginia Infantry Company B. So, a little bit about Eli. He had 8 siblings. His parents were Thompson Cooper and Nancy Pomeroy Cooper. They lived on a farm in Boone County, West Virginia, and it wasn't a huge farm, not like a plantation or anything. In West Virginia, we didn't really have lots of sprawling land and lots of fertile soil. We have lots of hills, lots of woods and creeks and such. So, the farms here were a lot smaller than the ones further to the east and the south in Virginia. But on their family farm, they raised cattle, hogs, sheep. They had horses, of course, and they also raised chickens. Of Eli's siblings, he was the closest with one of his older brothers, William, who was born in 1838. Now, Eli was born on the family farm in Boone County in August of 1844. When the Civil War first broke out, Eli did not enlist. A lot of men in what became West Virginia knew that they were in a war-torn territory. There were lots of partisan groups that were running around, damaging property, burning houses, shooting people, on both sides, that is. There was a Unionist militia that was well known in Boone County, but there were also some partisan groups running around for the Confederacy, so nobody really wanted to make their intentions known as to what side they fought for. Put yourself in their shoes. If you knew that there were people running around with guns, harassing people based on what they believed, are you going to go make yourself a target by joining up with an army and marching away, leaving your family defenseless against these groups that are running around destroying property? I sure wouldn't. However, there were legitimate military organizations that were beginning to organize in the area following John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Among these groups was a group in Putnam County, West Virginia, which came to be known as the Buffalo Guards, which would eventually become Company A of the 36th Virginia Infantry. Let me talk a little bit about the 36th Virginia's early service. Their first taste of combat was at a place called Scary Creek. That was their very first battle. Then they went on to fight in Nicholas County, West Virginia, at some places called Kessler's Cross Lanes, and the Battle of Carnifax Ferry, West Virginia, where the Confederates there under General Floyd successfully held off the Union attack against Camp Golly. And during the night, General Floyd retreated with his army down the hillside, across the ferry, and up the next hillside, leaving only a flag for the Union Army to see, and they somehow managed to slip away with minimal casualties, and it's nothing short of a miracle, in all honesty. But that's a story for another day. I could talk for hours about the Battle of Carnifax Ferry. After Carnifax Ferry, they went west to Fort Donelson, Tennessee, where they were nearly captured. And this is an interesting story as well. The 36th Virginia escaped on a steamboat out of Fort Donelson just before the fort fell in February of 1862. Why is this interesting? If you think about the Confederacy, you don't see a whole lot of Confederate troops. A lot of the Confederate soldiers identified by their state rather than as Americans or as, Confederate soldiers. They saw themselves as proud Virginians. They were fighting for Virginia. They were fighting for North Carolina. You get the idea of states' rights. North Carolina wasn't fighting for Georgia. Georgia wasn't fighting for South Carolina. Every state was fighting for themselves. The soldiers that were sent in to replace the fleeing Virginians on this steamboat were from Mississippi. Now, let's think on that for just a minute. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, where was he from? Yes, he was originally born in Kentucky, but where was he from? Mississippi. He had led Mississippi troops during the Mexican War, and so when the Mississippi troops were sent in to the fort, basically just to be surrendered and captured, that did not sit very well with Jefferson Davis, and it actually caused a lot of tension between Floyd and Davis later on. So either way, you can just imagine the discussion and the hushed whispers and the swearing and the tension. You can just imagine how these guys must have felt watching the Mississippians march past them into the fort, knowing darn well that they are just being sent into the slaughter, basically. They're just being sent to take your place. So I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall just to see the exchange there. The Mississippians go into the fort, the 36th Virginia escapes on the steamboat, and they make their way out of Fort Donelson and they come back east. Now, during the later part of 1862, after they've come back from Fort Donelson, the 36th Virginia took part in the Kanawha Valley Campaign. This is where my ancestors enter the picture. Eli Cooper enlisted in the 36th Virginia on September 15, 1862 in Boone County. Now, his brother William had already enlisted. He had enlisted in March of 1862, so Eli, I guess, was waiting for a chance to catch up with his older brother William, and he finally got his chance in September of 1862. In November of 1862, the Confederates left the Kanawha Valley, and the Union Army entered again without firing a shot. And this is where my ancestor Eli truly begins his experiences with the 36th Virginia Infantry. After the Kanawha Valley Campaign, the 36th Virginia didn't do a whole lot because they were going into winter quarters, kind of like we are now, with the roads becoming impassable and the weather getting worse. So, fast forwarding a little bit through the winter of 1862 into the spring and the summer of 1863, the 36th Virginia did not do a ton in 1863. They spent a lot of time guarding railroads and such. There were a couple of minor skirmishes here and there, but they didn't take part in too many grand battles with thousands of soldiers on both sides blasting away at each other. They had a pretty boring year compared to the rest of the army, which fought at places like Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, and you get the idea. Now, in 1864, it's a completely different story for the 36th Virginia Infantry. To start out with, they found themselves at a place called Cloyd's Mountain, Virginia, in the spring of 1864. Granted, they had been places before that, technically they had lost battles, but they had never actually been driven in defeat from the field. The first time this happens is at Cloyd's Mountain, Virginia in 1864. They were extremely, extremely demoralized from the experience. It was the first true taste of defeat the men had ever had. After the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain, the men found themselves at a place called Piedmont, Virginia in June of 1864. This is where Eli Cooper becomes a prisoner of war. The 36th Virginia was on the flank of the army, meaning they were the end of the line. Now, they were facing off to the left of the line, and they had the rest of the brigade behind them, the 60th Virginia, the 45th Virginia, and so on down the line. And during the fighting that took place here, the 36th Virginia was so hotly and heavily engaged that they did not realize until the rest of the brigade was virtually off the field that they were the only regiment left fighting. And one man happened to turn around and say, "Oh my God, are we being left to be captured?" And then it became every man for himself. Some men decided to try to swim across the river that was there. Most of them were shot trying to swim across the river. My ancestor, Eli, decided not to go that route. He fled into the woods behind him and straight into the arms of the Union soldiers that were waiting there. So he was stripped of his weapon, his accoutrements, anything he could use to fight with, and he was sent north to Indianapolis, Indiana, to a place called Camp Morton. Now, if anybody here knows a lot about Camp Morton, you'll know that at the beginning of the war it was a training ground for Union soldiers, but a little bit later on it became a prisoner of war camp following the fall of Fort Donelson, Tennessee, and a man by the name of Richard Owen was placed in command there, and the soldiers actually talked about how generous this guy was. He actually let the Confederates form, like little clubs, in the camp. They had literary societies, they had little bands put together to play instruments and sing songs, and granted, they were still prisoners of war and were still placed under guard, but it wasn't as bad as some of the other places that they could have been sent. There was actually a monument erected to Richard Owen after the war at what was the site of Camp Morton. So he wasn't a horrible guy, and he actually set the model for a lot of the Union prisoner of war camps. By the time my ancestor arrived at Camp Morton, the rules had changed a little bit. There was a new guy in charge. He, made things a little bit more strict. So there wasn't quite as much freedom, but it still wasn't as bad as some of the other places that he could have possibly been sent. During this time, the 36th Virginia continued to fight their battles. In September of 1864, the 36th Virginia Infantry found themselves in the Battle of 3rd Winchester. It was here that they actually lost their collars to a New York cavalryman. However, it also has another important aspect for me. It was at this battle that Eli's older brother William, who I talked about earlier in the video, this is where he was killed in action. He is buried somewhere in Winchester. We're not exactly sure where, because the Confederates were driven from the field and the Union Army was tasked with burying the dead. And how are you supposed to know somebody you've never met before? So I imagine he is probably buried with the unknowns in Winchester, Virginia, in the Confederate section of the cemetery immediately across the street from the National Cemetery where the Union casualties are buried. Meanwhile, at Camp Morton, Indiana, Eli had no way of knowing this. But he was at Camp Morton until he decided to take the Oath of Allegiance, or the Amnesty Oath, on April 4th of 1865. By this point, they had more prisoners coming in, that they knew the war was over, and I guess he decided that he was just ready to go back home after spending almost a year in captivity. So in April of 1865, he begins his trek back home to Boone County, and I imagine upon arrival home is probably where he learned about his brother's death. After Eli returned home, he actually married Ruth Cooper. His father, Thompson, died in 1866. Eli was a farmer. He resumed his farming activities, and he died in Winifred, West Virginia, sometime before 1920. We're not exactly sure when he died. I've not found any obituaries. There's no death certificate. And some things have been passed down through the family for generations. Among these was his canteen, which I am so thankful to have. This was given to me by my great-great-aunt Ruth upon her passing. She actually left this to me, and her executors from her will and her estate, my cousins, gave me this because they knew what a history fanatic I am, and they know that this is something I will always treasure and will always take care of. We don't know where Eli is buried, nor his wife. There are lots of Coopers that are buried in Winifred at places such as Sawmill Cemetery and Peter's Graveyard. Lots of graves have become unmarked over the years, and I imagine that he probably just had a simple wooden marker that has decomposed, fallen apart over the years, and nobody knew to replace it. So I'll probably never know exactly where he's buried, but as long as there is breath in my lungs and blood flowing through my veins, Eli Cooper and William Cooper will never be forgotten. I've got some things I got to take care of today, so I want to thank you very much for joining me in the first installment of the Winter Quarters series. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Take care, and God bless, my friends.